Welcome to Athena's Stained Glass. I'm Stellathena and I will be your instructor. This project is supported in part by the National Foundation for the Arts and a grant from the Tamarack Foundation for the Arts. If you would like to learn more about how the National Foundation for the Arts grants impact individuals and communities, visit www.arts.gov. Now that you know how to do straight line cuts in stained glass and build quilt square pattern, you've learned a lot of the skills necessary to make a stained glass box. So that's what we're going to do today. To be safe, you'll need about 90 square inches of stained glass. You'll need about 70 to 80 inches for the box body, the bottom of the box, and then you'll need about 20 square inches for the pattern for the lid. You're going to need your framing square, your household shears, as well as your pattern shears, your Grozing Pliers, your handy dandy brush for sweeping away shards. You'll need your needle nose pliers, your nips, stained glass cutter, soldering iron with stand, and a little cleaning sponge. You'll also need a brush for cleaning your project. You need some cleaner to clean it with. So you'll also need your glass grinder. For this project, you're going to need your goggles, your gloves, copper foil, Flux with a brush, 60-40 solder, electrical tape, some box chain, some 3/32 copper tubing. This is a specialty item to make the hinge. A paper clip, some copper wire, and patina, which comes in copper or black, depending on the type of backing you need for your foil. If you use a copper foil with a translucent glass, you'll need the copper patina. If you use translucent glass with the black foil, you'll need black patina, but these are optional. And one specialty tool, Dremel tool with a cutting blade to cut your brass tubing. The first thing we need to do is to cut out our pattern. You can use your regular household shears to cut around the outside of your pattern. This is a 4x4 box. Notice the box lid is just a little bit bigger, about 1/8 of an inch bigger on each side. But when you're separating pieces that hit up against one another, it's best to use a pair of pattern shears, and you cut right down the center of the line. It removes the amount of material that is equivalent to the thickness of the foil which you'll wrap your pieces with. Notice that each piece has a number and an arrow indicating the number in the pattern and the direction on which to lay this onto the glass. A good box pattern will have two places in the pattern where the joints will attach to the hinge. So our box lid will attach to the hinge at these 2 points. So you need at least 2 places where it will attach well to the hinge. So now we have all of our pieces. These will be one color of glass. Actually, all of these pieces will be the same color. The triangles will be a different color, and then the square in the center will be a third color. Since I've already discussed with you in a previous lesson how to cut the glass and how to lay the pieces on the grain of the glass, and how to grind, wrap, and foil the glass, I'm not going to go into that again today. One thing I do want to mention though is when you're laying out your pattern for your sides of your box, you want to lay them end for end like this, so that when you make the score and break your glass, the height of your box sides are going to be all the same, because it's important that your one side of your box isn't higher or lower than the other. So when I lay this out, I'll lay these end for end, or measure over 2 inches and then up the height of 4, 8, 12, 16 inches, so that this is all square and straight. The bottom will also come out of this, as will these pieces, and I'm going to lay the arrow in the direction that the grain is going. So I'll get all these pieces out. I would lay those in the direction that the grain is going in this glass. Remember to choose the side of the glass that's the smoothest when you get ready to mark and cut your glass. I've decided to use a clear piece in the center without any direction to it, without any grain, because I didn't want to have to turn that. It might look a little strange if it just didn't look good against the other pieces that were following a grain. So I think this would look best if I had this piece clear. So my triangle is going to come out of this type of yellow, and my square in the center is going to be of the clear cathedral. So after you cut your strip that's 2 inches wide, you're then going to cut each piece out so that all the pieces will be the same height. Now, one thing I recommend that you do for the bottom piece of the box is kind of round off the corners, so that when we put the box together, the solder will fill that little hole and get a good connection to the side seam that comes up to hold all the sides together. So I do recommend you take the corners off just a little. So I've cut out all my pieces, and you'll notice that the bottom is going to be just a little bit smaller than the lid, because this lid needs to cover up the sides. So now that I have all my pieces cut, that's where my square comes in handy, and I need to grind each piece to make sure that the sides are ground to a flat plane. This is kind of uneven and sharp and jagged, so we need to get those all ground. So once we have ground it and put the foil on it, then we can put it together. So now that you've learned how to do straight cuts, you can now make a stained glass box, because you've learned everything that you need to know about cutting and grinding, foiling, and soldering straight cut stained glass. So now you have all the skills to make a box. So I'm not going to put you through all the cutting and grinding and wrapping. So but you do need 2 copies of your pattern, most importantly just the lid part, so that you can put your pieces back on and make sure that they fit properly. In order to do this project, you're going to have about 90 square inches of stained glass, but this could be made out of scraps that you have accumulated. So you need 4 pieces of glass cut and ground and wrapped, which are 2 by 4 inches, and then the bottom is going to be 4 by 4 inches, and then the lid is going to be slightly bigger, about 4 1/4 by 4 1/4, because it has to cover the sides So when you fit your pieces together, it has to accommodate the width of your glass. So, and I also wanted to point out that you needed to round the corners of the bottom just a little so that it would allow a little space for the solder to melt down into and really grab hold of the seam of the box. So let me go over some of the materials that you'll need, some of your supplies. One specialty item that you'll need to make a box with a hinged lid is this brass tube. And they come in about 12-inch lengths, and it has a little hole through the center. You'll need a paper clip, believe it or not. They sell little rods to make the hinges, but it's cheaper just to use a paper clip. So I straighten out the paper clip and make two little angles like this. It doesn't have to be the whole length of your side, as long as it fits down in and anchors pretty well. And it doesn't have to go all the way across. It just needs to fit into your tube. So it just needs to fit into the end of the tube. And we'll cut this later to fit the width of the box. You'll need your other normal supplies for putting this together. You'll need your gloves, especially when you're doing 3D projects, because there's the danger of molten metal dripping on you. And by all means, have a pair of goggles when you're grinding especially. So that's some of the supplies. You'll need at least one framing square, but I recommend two. So what I'm going to show you today, which is different than I've showed you so far, is how to assemble your pieces to make a box. So we're going to begin with the bottom, and then we're going to arrange the sides. We're going to have to remember to put the rough side up when we're assembling this, because we want the smooth outer side to be on the outside of the box. So your box is going to be assembled like this, but in order to make sure they're straight, you'll need to use your square. Again, make sure all the rough side is facing up. This is where your tape may come in handy. And I use electrical tape because it will hold up to heat, whereas other tapes will melt. You want to have enough tape for the length of your box. You don't want it to stretch it. You just want it to be loose, because you don't want it to contract and pull your pieces together. So just kind of loosely lay it out, and just a little bit above leave a space in between the tape and the square. And I like to use 2 pieces of tape, otherwise it'll flop. I find tape to be very tedious, but I'm showing you this because, you know, if you have trouble trying to hold it all together, this is an option. But you don't want the tape to go above your box pieces. You want the bottoms of your pieces to fit nicely up against your square. Now, when you're assembling your box, you might want to put it up on its edge like this, and then let it fall, so that there's a little gap to give it room to be folded up against one another. The main thing is to keep it straight along the bottom. Like that. Alright, so press it down so that it gets stuck to your tape. Now you're going to basically wrap this around the bottom. So I'm going to put this bottom here. And kind of wrap it around the bottom. Now, I'm going to move this out of the way. Now I'm going to put the corner of the box into the squares, because I want my box to be very square. And you can also use your other square go the other way to make sure that it's nice and square. So I need flux. So I'm just going to flux the corners. Now I want there to be this little L-shaped 90 degrees notch. I don't want the box to, I don't want this piece to come over on top of this. I want there to be this 90-degree little notch because it's going to get filled with solder. So I need your 60-40 solder and just put just a little dab, just enough to hold it, because if we need to do any adjustments, we don't want it soldered real well because it'll be harder to get out. And then do that to each corner. And now you can probably get rid of that tape. Now, it's always a good idea when you're working with 3D projects to put at least one glove on your non-dominant hand so you save yourself a burn. So now I'm going to take a bit of flux and flux the inside corners of the box and the outside corners. And then I'm just going to tack those in place at the bottom. So this is where those rounded corners really help, because the solder can get down in that little crevice. Now I can very gently turn this over. I can flux. I'm going to do a flat solder because I'm going to add legs to this box. You don't have to add legs. And I'll come back and add a little more solder after I've added the legs. So I do realize there's a gap there. Now, again, I can gently turn it. And now I'm going to do the corners. There's two corners that I'm going to leave open, and I'm looking for the one with the biggest gap. So I think these two have the biggest gap. I'll use that to put the hinge in. So I'm going to make that kind of flat too, because I want to put a little decorative solder on the corners. Now I'll go ahead and add some flux to the edging and just tin wherever there's copper showing. So I'm going to set this aside. And I use this part of my pattern when I'm assembling the pieces as I grind, but I also use it as a guide to see where my pieces go. So and these have numbers. I think the number came off of that one. So this is number 3. And be careful, you know, as you're soldering, these little tiny pieces of solder bead get on your surface and they will get in between your pieces, and you think, how is it possible that it would fit well when I ground it and fit it together? Now it isn't. It's because a little piece of solder got in between. So I have 4, 2, 3, 7 in the center, and 5, 6. Now I can move this out of the way. Then go ahead and flux wherever you see copper. I like to start on the outside, especially with beginners, to start on the outside and come towards the center, rather than going out to the outside edge, because you have a tendency to pull that solder off. So you can work inward. But if you do work outward, just remember, don't pull it off. Just go in an L shape and lift your soldering iron so you don't pull the solder off onto your work surface. So our object right now is just to get enough solder on our seam to cover the copper foil, and you want it to have a rounded bead. You don't want it to be flat. Then you can also tin around the outside while you're at it. Go back and just smooth out any lumps or bumps that you find. Kind of pause at the intersection to let everything melt together. You don't want to work in one place very long, or you may crack your glass or have the solder run through to the other side. So now, this isn't too hot, but it's still kind of fragile. I'm going to just turn it over, flux the other side, just like we did when we did the stained glass quilt square pattern. And I just feed my solder to my iron. And if I hold it in one place very long, that'll pile up and cause a blob. Just smooth it out. And if it gets to be too much, if you get too much on there, you can always, I'm trying to get too much on there to show you. If you get too much on there, just move it to the side. You can pull it off. Don't try to get this off the glass if it falls on the glass, because you'll end up cracking it. It'll cool and you can flip it off later. Don't forget your solder gets hot too. And it will burn you if you try to grab hold of it when you're wanting to unravel it. So use your gloved hand to unravel your solder. And then tin around the outside of your project. Make sure all the copper is covered. Okay, now, I still see a piece of copper showing. All right, now I can turn this up on its end. You don't want it to be tilted in any direction. You just want it straight up and down, like it could almost stand there by itself. Make sure that your hand is gloved, that you have flux all the way around. Then I just add so that's the box lid. This is the front, the top of it. This is the underneath. So now I'm going to attach the lid to the box, and I do that with, well, I better leave my glove on. I just first put the end of my paper clip into this section. Then I'm going to measure. I want this not to come all the way, if you can zoom in. I don't want my rod to come all the way over, because see how it pushes that out away, this little stem away from the corner. So this needs to come back onto the edge just a little. So as I'm measuring, that's what I'm doing right now, I'm just kind of measuring. So I'm going to take my Sharpie, and again I'm going to measure back just a little bit so that my stem has enough room to make that bend. It doesn't get pushed out. So I'm going to cut it about right there. And it doesn't have to be exact, because you know, you want a little play in it. But now I'm going to need my goggles and my Dremel tool. Right where I made my mark, I'm going to use my Dremel tool and just cut that off. It cuts pretty easily. Sometimes if it's got a little burr on it, which this does, I'll just tap that on the wheel and smooth that out a little bit so it's not jagged. Now I will need a piece of paper just to protect the edge. Just a scrap piece of paper will do. It's just to protect this because I don't want to solder my hinge tube to my box. I have to put something in there to protect it. And I don't want it to fit real snug against that because I want it to be able to roll. So I'm going to double up my paper and put it on there. So now I'm going to take my paper clip that I've modified and put one end in. Put my glove back on. Let's just put this here and get it tacked. Then I solder the end first. Then I solder it closer to the top to get it to stick. That way, this might be cool if this is hot. If they were both hot at the same time, it might pop loose. So I try to solder it at different places so that it just anchors it in place. And then I do the same thing to the other side. You don't want the pieces that you put in the tube to be so long that they bump up into one another. And you don't want to get any flux around the entrance of this tube. You want to keep your solder down low. Leave it. You don't get too close to that tube opening because you don't want to do anything to seize up the tube. We want it to move freely. I think I fluxed that. Just as a precaution, I kind of keep it tilted just a little bit until I get it anchored. Now I can work on filling that in. If you work on one side and then the other, it won't get so hot and melt through. I get nervous when I get up next to that tube. I'll go to the other side and work for a while. Good thing I had my glove on. Boy, it'd be nice to have a box holder. They do make such a thing. I've done without it so long. I feel ashamed to get it now. Should have got it years ago. Some decorative solder here, so I start on the top and put a dot. And do the same thing, just put little decorative solder beads. And then do the same to the front. Now, I'm going to look on the inside to see if anything dripped through. And I want to keep this paper protecting the hinge. I'm not quite done with it yet. So now, I'm going to fit this onto the box because I want two places, two seams to stick to my hinge. So if I turned it the other way, there'd just be one place to attach it. I see a little spot. So when I designed this lid, I purposefully made two seams that I could solder to my hinge. So I'm going to make sure that my paper is protecting my box from getting stuck to the hinge, and I'm just going to put it doesn't have to go all the way across. So now I'm going to open it. If you had trouble keeping that box lid straight, you could use electric tape. One thing you don't want to do is to get a bead of solder in between the glass and the hinge. You know how if you get a big blob there, it's not going to close and open freely. Just pay attention to where solder may have dripped. And so there's your box with a hinged lid, and now we can remove the paper. I'm going to lay it on its side so that the lid is just slightly tilted back. Then I'm going to get enough box chain to just reach down into the corner of the box just a little, and then also I'm going to attach it to this seam in the lid. So I'm just going to put it here and measure about what I need. Get my little nips. And I like to use just a little bit of copper wire. I'm going to hook it through a link. make this little pigtail. Just solder it, and I'm going to pre-tin it before I try to attach it to the box. Well, I can show, maybe turn it when I'm done. I want to make sure that's anchored pretty well. Then I'm going to do the same to the other end of the chain. Just get a little snip of copper wire, just enough to hook through the link. So now I'm going to check to see if it closes, and that chain is not in the way. So look, it closes pretty well. And when I open it, it's not going to flop all the way back. It's just going to stay open just a little. So I'm going to give it a once over, see if there's any little blobs of solder. And you don't want to work it so long that you end up cracking your glass. Checking the lid. I'm going to turn it over and attach the feet. So the feet are optional, so it'll be fine without it. But sometimes if you're not careful, you'll put it down on top of something and then end up breaking the bottom. So feet on this project is a good idea. The thing you have to be careful about is finding solderable feet, because if they don't solder well, then it's not going to stick. And that's one problem I've had finding these, is they'll say they're brass, which should be solderable, but then when I order them and get them in, they're not solderable. So we'll see. This says it's brass, so I'll find out here in a minute. I'm going to try to get this solder to melt through. Oops. So we'll see. It doesn't look to me like these are going to be solderable, and I may end up gluing them if I choose to use them at all. So if they come off, yeah, it doesn't look like it's sticking. But maybe these little holes will. It's getting hard to find some of my supplies that I used to have no problem finding. Things like black back foil and solderable jewelry box legs. So there you have it. I think the legs are going to work out. Now, all I need to do is to take this in the house and give it a good scrubbing and then put a patina on it. And I think this project would look really good with a copper patina. It would do better to match the legs that are on there. I don't think black would be a good match. So let me go clean this up and I'll be back. So I'm using a copper patina, which is optional, but I think with the color of this glass and the color of the legs that I've added, that a copper patina would look nice. A black would also, and then you could either use a darker legs or paint the legs a little. But I like the copper. I'm kind of partial to the copper look. And I could have used a different color chain. I wanted to get real coordinated. So now that I've got it patinaed and cleaned up, this is my finished product.
Now I would like to challenge you to make your own box. Design your own pattern or use the one linked below. Watch the next video, Beginner Lesson 4, Easy Kaleidoscope. Thank you for watching Athena Stained Glass. God bless you and have a great day.